Good evening. We're on the last session, and I gather it's been an exhausting day. I kept getting WhatsApp messages about when I was going to come. I'm sorry I couldn't be there. I had an exhausting day too. I hope that there's some suitable libation after this because it's needed. But anyway, different sources of error and tension. I think we'll start the concluding session by requesting Dr. Garima Mohan to give us a report of essentially these day and a quarter, day and a half.
Thank you. Thank you all also for your attention. I've been given the easy task of summarizing the last day and a half of very rich discussions in 5 minutes. So I'll try to do my best. And sort of zoom out, look at the broader trends that have emerged from the conversations we've had all of today and parts of yesterday. When we look at China's quest for global and regional leadership, we saw that people talked about 4 main things. The first is domestic and external drivers of what's driving China to engage more regionally and globally as well. The second is instruments that China is using to carry out this engagement. The third one is narratives that China has woven around its external engagement, particularly leveraging historical narratives. And the fourth one is regional responses. How have countries and partners who work with China or dealt with China's presence in their regions reacted to what China is doing? So let's start with the domestic trends of China's external engagement. Clearly, factors such as economics, demographics, which is a long-term driver, survival of the party, as well as domestic drivers that we've seen in the case of BRI, for example, search for raw materials, export of excess capacities, and a very interesting point brought up earlier on the role of provinces and even cities in driving China's external engagement. I think when looking at domestic factors, these are all very interesting points that have come up in the conference. The second part, of course, is the external drivers for China's engagement, the most important being the neighborhood that it's situated in and the geography around China. So it was mentioned yesterday that China is located in a very crowded, hedged-in environment, can't afford to be isolationist like the US does. It is also not a neighborhood easy to dominate. As Admiral Chopra just mentioned, the restrictive maritime geography China faces is, of course, is a challenge that it has to deal with. And the second external driver is, of course, the space created by a somewhat retreat of the US, which is, of course, space that China has capitalized on. Now, when we look at the instruments that China has been using in its external engagement, the most fascinating one I found was the talk of controlling and setting standards, whether it is global technical manufacturing standards or legal and governance standards on governance issues. So we already see through BRI that through acquiring high-end technology as well as advanced manufacturing capabilities under Make in China 2025 agenda, China has been trying to set standards globally, technical and manufacturing standards. These have been exported through high-speed railways, port constructions, large infrastructure projects, where China can introduce its own standards in the DNA of these projects, which means that no other country or company can then move in. It's also setting global legal and governance standards by either staying out of established regimes or being proactive in new areas such as cyber and internet governance. The second important instrument that was mentioned this morning is civil-military fusion, so the dual use of ports, ships, technology, providing international public goods, but using that for establishing military hegemony. The example of the Beidou system was given this morning. It's also a very interesting instrument that China has been using. The third important instrument is, of course, the armed forces. We just heard about armed forces modernization, military reform, especially maritime capabilities, developing a blue water navy, An important caveat that emerged from this discussion, of course, is that having a blue water navy is not equivalent to having sea power and sustained projections, so that's something to be kept in mind. And lastly, of course, as an instrument is the institutions that China is building. So multilateral ones like AIIB, but also, as mentioned earlier in the sessions, trilaterals, quads, and other ways of Chinese engagement broadly, both regionally and globally. Now, what I found very interesting in the conference was the narratives China uses to weave around the way it engages with the world, and evoking heritage and cultural history, notions of history being used to reinforce its claims both domestically as well as internationally, is quite a remarkable and interesting development. The example of Cheng He's missions to bolster China's claims in the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean was, of course, a very solid, concrete example that came up today, but also the idea of an imagined past, that there are multiple narratives of history, but the Chinese government is using one particular interpretation that is being instrumentalized by the state. That's also an interesting development that came out today. And finally, the last point that I mentioned was regional responses. How are other countries reacting to China's engagement regionally and globally? We saw examples from Southeast Asia, for example, of managing China, of engaging, but also standing up at times, drawing the lines. In India's neighborhood, of course, if we look at South Asian engagement through the lens of BRI, we've seen several developments. Of course, these countries have welcomed Chinese investments, but we've also seen criticisms domestically, whether it be in Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Pakistan, etc. And I do feel that with BRI, China will have to engage not only economically, but it will also have to deal with the domestic political consequences of large-scale BRI investments in these countries. And as we're looking in examples from Africa, it's already clear that when it comes to questions of sort of political involvement of domestic political elites in these projects, they'll create more headaches for China. So it's not just a win-win story. BRI will have more complicated outcomes. Of course, for India, this raises an important question. How do we engage with our neighborhood? How the Chinese room for maneuver in South Asia has exponentially increased because of internal divisions in South Asia, as Dr. Mohan mentioned. What options does that leave for India? Of course, that's an important question and a takeaway from this conference that needs to be considered. When it comes to Europe, Ambassador Vadva mentioned the economic impact of BRI on European industry pretty clearly. However, the impact on European unity and cohesion is also a very important outcome of BRI. We have heard of platforms such as 16+1 that have been sort of used to divide Europe internally, but also the rise of political influencing that has come with Chinese money in a lot of southern and central Eastern European countries is an important example. That these countries have consistently vetoed European resolutions on China shows the sort of depth of Chinese political power and influence, along with economic influence in Europe. And finally, we heard of a number of marriage metaphors for Chinese engagement in Latin America. So China has a huge investment in Latin America, of course, that rescued a number of these countries from the brink. But will this turn into political influence, as we saw in the case of Europe? What would it look like? These are important open questions, perhaps to be answered at some other point. And talking of open questions, I think a couple of things that were missing from the discussion that we had, perhaps China's engagement in Africa, which is quite important also for India particularly, something to be covered in perhaps the next session, next iteration of the conference. But also a number of speakers spoke of domestic drivers of Chinese foreign policy, how domestic audience is an important consideration, and yet we had a very statist analysis here. We had very few people talking about societal changes in China. We had a couple of speakers in the context of Buddhism mention this, or mention the crackdown on civil society There was one question on gender. But these are important issues, and I think in order to understand or develop a comprehensive understanding of China, we do need to consider what's going on inside of China and not treat it as either a black box or a cohesive thing that should be sort of unpacked further. That's important. And then, of course, finally, a broad question of what kind of leadership would China assert. Right at the beginning of the conference, there was a distinction made between power and leadership, and that is something perhaps to be teased out a little further, whether China will be a revisionist power. It has benefited a lot from the status quo. What kind of world would it want to create, etc. Perhaps those are questions that can be considered if at the second India Forum on China. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Absolutely brilliant, actually. Thank you very much, Dr. Garma. That was wonderful and really succinct summary. I think I'll now turn to Ambassador Sri Menon and invite him to kindly deliver a concluding address, please.
Thank you very much. And there really isn't much to say after we've all talked through the whole day. You've had a long day. I don't want to make it too much longer. But I did want to say that for me this was not so much an exhausting day as a stimulating day. I was really struck by the quality of what we heard, and that it was no effort at all actually to stay alert and to actually follow what was going on. And that is very rare. I tell you honestly, after a long life in bureaucracy, you really appreciate a meeting where you're alert right through the day. So thank you to all of you for making this possible. It really was. But I think the reason it was stimulating was because one kept learning, at least I did. I don't know about the rest of you. I found it interesting that, when you think of this title, Deciphering China's Quest for Global and Regional Leadership, nobody questioned the fact of China's quest. If we had done this forum about 5-6 years ago, there'd have been questions about, no, do you really think that China actually wants? And what we questioned was the leadership part of it. But even then, I think everybody accepted, bottom line, that there was primacy was the goal. There was no longer a question of, oh, will she share power, will she be integrated into the existing system? None of those questions which 2 years ago, 3 years ago, would have occupied a meeting like this, they've all vanished. And it's amazing how quickly we've all sort of moved on. I mean, I find that really quite amazing, that it's happened really within the last 2 or 3 years. And this general conviction that we're now dealing with a new kind of leader, a new kind in Xi Jinping, and that China is also behaving quite differently, and that her goals are quite clear. I get worried when there's so much consensus about China around the world. This, honestly, every time we've had this kind of consensus before, we've been wrong as a community of China watchers. So I do think that maybe there are 2 or 3 things that, and Garima mentioned one of them, that we should be looking at when we start considering issues like this. And one of them is China internal. We all seem to be agreed that that's the primary driver of what China does. But then why aren't we spending more time studying it and talking about those linkages? The other part, for me, and this is personal, I know most people won't share this, is really China's history. I found the sessions on, or at least the presentations on that. Now, there are 2 opinions on this, as I think one person said very rightly that the situation now is so different that history is not really a direct guide to what China is going to do today. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't affect China at the broader level in terms of what kind of leadership does China seek, what kinds of roles does she envisage for herself, how does she imagine her past and imagine her future. That, I think, is the product of her history. And I think that actually is critical. And I think somehow we need to, somebody used the phrase that it's an imagined past, but it's also an imagined future. But I think we do need to look at these 2 parts of it and their relationship to how China acts as a state, as a power. Now, it's been said 3 or 4 times at different stages that this is too statist a view that we are taking of China. And I know that's the politically correct thing to say today. But you know, China is a state. And it's not just a state, it's a party which is a state, it's an army which became a party, which became a state, and so on and so forth. And many of these distinctions that apply in other societies, we had somebody raised twice, thrice about civil-military relations in China. Frankly, those categories that we apply to our societies are completely irrelevant in China. I mean, a PLA general is primarily a party member, and he thinks of himself as such. There's no more talk in China for now, already for many years, of being a professional general. That idea has never been popular except for a very brief period in China of being a professional general. Now, if you don't even consider that, then what are you talking about, you know, civil military? The civilians are not civilians either in the sense in which we think of it in our societies. So I think we need to do a little more thinking about how to frame this. I don't think we should take or project on China categories that maybe make sense in the way we look at ourselves. But I don't mean to give you another long lecture. Let's start all over again tomorrow morning and do another 12 hours of this. I do hope we have another occasion to do this. I mean, we have a very nice, a very generous offer for a home. I don't know what ICS and the Avinash room will decide about that. I know I'd be very happy to come to Goa regularly. But maybe next time you should give us some time on the beach and give us a chance to get out of this. But thank you to Goa, thank you to ICS, thank you to all of those who made this possible for really a really good day. And let me wish you all the very best. And I do hope that the next time maybe we need to narrow the focus a little bit when we think of the next one. But thank you for everything, and remarkable that you could actually bring it all down to 5 minutes. Thank you. All the best.
Thanks ever so much. I'm going to be very brief before I tell it over to Kevin. But I mean, I guess, you know, we are in a moment of power transition. And we may even be in a moment of system transformation. The first is certain, the second we're not certain about. But, you know, you can also be certain about another thing, that we are living in times of strategic uncertainty. And at times of strategic uncertainty, it's not surprising that states, whatever their relative movement of power scales, tend to generally follow hedging strategies. It makes sense, it's logical. So one of the questions really is China no longer hedging? You know, and I think from what I understand, over the course of today, the consensus seems to be that whatever else China is doing is no longer pursuing a hedging strategy, which is really interesting. Now, you know, can history help us here? It seems to me that sort of, you know, you could put the question 2 ways. You could ask the question, you know, by asking, well, how have great powers risen in the past? And if you were to look at the last 2 great powers that rose in the past, in the last century, Japan and the Soviet Union, they rose in the crucible of war. You know, that was how great powers rose. That's how they fell. That was historically the pattern. You know, Paul Kennedy says this, that, you know, wars, you know, stimulate the potentially strong and drain the essentially weak. And that was really the role of war in international politics. So Japan and the Soviet Union, wars is what made them great powers. But the problem, of course, is that general wars, systemic wars, great power wars, are very difficult to envisage today, thanks to the annihilative capabilities of military technology. So, in a way, the question is, how are you going to mark these changes in relative power? the sort of war, the test of war, the historical way in which it goes down, is no longer sort of there. And the other sort of way to ask the question, I think, is, what happened the last time a systemic hegemon faced relative decline? Because clearly that is one way in which you can characterize that time. And I mean, the last example there was the United Kingdom. But what the UK did was essentially engineer a hegemonic transition in favor of the United States. And it did so because it had the confidence that its core interests would be protected by that hegemonic transition. But the problem is, neither of these are really going to at all apply in the current case. So it doesn't matter how we ask the question. The basic point I'd like to suggest is that history is actually a very poor guide. It's not really going to tell us very much, and this is really a case where the essential conditions about this case are just different. And it'd be great, I think, partly for us to also sort of begin to mine history and try to sort of get a sense, and history both in that systemic sense, and I'm referring history in the sense of China and its millennial sort of culture and all the rest of it. And I think it's really important. Anytime there's it seems to me really that, and I'm really sorry I wasn't here today, it was just that this is my last working day before 3 weeks away, so I'm just getting away from here for a while. I think an India forum on China is a really good idea, and I think it's really important that once a year, people who think about these things seriously, people who practice this and think about this, actually get together and sort of focus and cogitate on this. It's really, really important. And anytime there is a good idea, the question always is, why did it not happen before? To which there is also a very simple and elegant answer, which is because the moment was not yet right. So good ideas sort of finally germinate when the moment is right. And I think it seems to me that the moment is right now for Indians who think about these events, and those are our overseas cognates, collaborators who get together once a year and think about this. If you decide that Goa is the place you want to do it next year, we promise you we'll do it on the beach. It's not a problem. It's very easy to arrange. Very easy to arrange. But I think Japan has the last question.
Thank you. All right. You saw me in the exact same spot a few hours ago, and the only difference, what's the difference really? The difference is I rolled up my sleeves. Because frankly, I was chilled out in the first time I was here, but this is the most terrifying part of the evening really for me. So please bear with me. The vote of thanks is a ceremony, is a necessary Indian ceremony. And if I should forget anybody, my boss has promised that person a final single malt. So, you don't have to worry if I do forget somebody. That makes my job so much easier. Let me start with my former boss and mentor, General Banerjee. This is the first person I'd like to thank, because the idea that we first took to General Banerjee, and it was him who sort of, with his vast experience creating, gestating new projects, new ideas over several decades in this line of work, who sort of gave us the encouragement, gave us the push, gave us the direction. So my special thanks to General Dipankar Banerjee. Next, I'd like to thank our principal partners, the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, and the very enthusiastic Mr. Peter Ramele. He's just arrived in India, frankly, and it's been a few months, and the moment we took it to him, he sort of jumped at it and was with us from day one. And let me not forget, he's always enthusiastic, always with a solution. Deputy Mr. Pankaj Madan, it's such a pleasure working with him. My first conference on China was with the CAS, so it's kind of, I like to think I learned grew a lot in the 10, 12 years since that first conference. Of course, China has also changed immensely in those 10, 12 years. So it's kind of fitting that the CAS is here to help us help this next stage of the conference at just the right moment. Our partner at Goa University, Dr. Varun Sani, has been very generous with his time and with his ideas, temptations for the next forum. Professor Aparajita Gangopadhyay, who also helped us with the All India Conference of China Studies. Let me thank both of you very much for your cooperation over the last 5 days of conferencing, really. And the students of Goa University who have been active volunteers helped sort of pull this thing together. Let me also thank you for your support in helping us invite the Governor of Goa to this occasion. I thought her speech, short as it was very sweet and hit all the right notes and sort of set the ball rolling for this particular conference. Let me thank our supporters. The Australian High Commission was very helpful in supporting Professor Rigby's presence at this conference. The International Centre Goa, you always have to thank the venue. I mean, they do an amazing amount of work, and always very quick. Why I like ICG over IIC is that because it has a swimming pool which I haven't visited yet, but it's certainly a recommendation I would take back to Delhi, to the IIC. The swimming pool, that is. Let me thank Ambassador Shyam Saran, who's not here with us, but took out time from a very important personal engagement and was with us because he made this commitment in an excellent, scintillating keynote address. He's been very, very helpful and a big support especially over the last few months. To Ambassador Srishant Menon, who we interrupted in the process of writing his next book in Singapore. He's come all the way for this particular conference, and so we look forward to your next book. I hope this conference has helped in some way. To all the other distinguished participants at this conference who have given up your time, your expertise, your wisdom, and who patiently stuck through an entire day and a half of conferencing. I know it's been heavy work, heavy going for everyone. The participants from the Naval War College, again, who've been here for quite a long time, for 5 days. We have several participants from defense institutions around the country who have come here and sort of encouraged us eggers on. To the participants of the All India Conference of China Studies, 5 days of conference is pretty intense work. And if you, those of you who are participating only for the IFC for 1.5 days is bad, please congratulate those guys who resisted the temptation to go to the beach for the last 5 days. I haven't seen the beach. So, and many of these guys have not seen the beach either. Finally, to the ICS team, the idea was entirely Ambassador Khan's. The rest of us just put it together. And in this vote of thanks, I also must apologize to some of my colleagues who I had the pleasure of chewing out over the last couple of days for things done, left undone. And if you thought that nothing was out of place, well, that's partly because of all the hard work that they put in. So my apologies. It's my job to sort of chew out a few of you every now and then to sort of get off some steam. But to the Assistant Director, Dr. Arvind Yellary, to Rajesh, Nena, and Tiki especially, who've done a lot of running around, some of the participants from the AICC who always did special thanks. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, this is the first conference in the history of India that has actually finished before time. So I think that's a testament to your professionalism and commitment, and thank you all once again.